The perfume haunted me. It fluttered through the air, and it teased me, leading me towards an obscured end. I ran down the hallways, bathed in red tapestries, my nightgown shuddering in the cold. Moonlight showered me as the way that I searched for the perfume's source. Around blind corners and through doorways of solid oak, and into rooms once filled with laughter and terrible deeds. With each step, the scent grew stronger. Roses, a sting of ginger and citrus, never quite putting my finger on the familiarity of it all. And when I entered the chamber, the old room that differed from the rest, one solitary candle sat by a large 4-poster bed. The light cascaded out, revealing a room dark and brooding. The floor was cold, and the wood warped slightly. My bare feet lost what little heat they once held. A huge fireplace lay opposite the bed, unlit and devoid of life. And above it, a large portrait dominated the room. In the painting, a woman sat, wearing a dark green dress of many decades past. Her hair was pulled tightly in a bun, and her pale skin like languid pearl, and her eyes cold and cruel with dispassion. Those eyes seemed to watch, following me as I wandered around the bed until I stood at its foot. A once rich, now faded crimson blanket covered the mattress, and as the candlelight struggled against my unseen draft, it became clear that someone lay in the bed. I could not see the face of this person. The body was covered from head to foot by the red blanket, shrouded by it. The sight of the cloth outline struck fear into my heart. I dared not remove the blanket, uncertain that my nerves could endure the shock. Again, I was stung by the familiarity of it all, a memory hiding in the shadows just out of sight, refusing to reveal itself. The pungent rose perfume was stronger than it had been before, as I could feel the spiteful gaze of the portrait behind me, watching the proceedings. Then I noticed another scent, something that had festered in the room for years, obscured by the sweetness of the perfume. A foul underbelly. As I stared at the outline of the head and the body beneath the blanket, the stench grew. And with each breath, I was treated to a mixture of roses and something humid, murky, like soil after a downpour. There was something rotten in the room with me, the rancid smell so thick that I could taste it. The hidden memory thickened to break loose from its chains. I had to flee. Run. Be away from the room, that house, out in the open where I could breathe again. I walked quickly to the door where I had entered, and it was locked. I twisted at the metal handle, its spherical body covered in dark brown paint. The locked mechanism entombed in the oak echoed into the distant recesses that taunted me and resisted. I was a prisoner confined to a solitary room, to a place where the sweet air of flowers was mixed with that of death. And I pounded at the door, shouted and screamed. But my pleas went unanswered. They simply faded into the lonely house, my family home, which I had not visited since I was 7, a place that hid dark recollections, the wounds that ran deep, covered thinly by the preceding decades. And last I gave in. I stopped my protests, rested my forehead on the cold wooden surface of the locked door, and tried to compose myself. And then I heard the sound. One at first, followed by 3 others. It was a clicking, creaking noise. I turned around slowly to see what was there, but the room was as it had been. The body in the bed lay still, the blanket forming a perfect impression of it. The bedside candle flickered but remained, and as it did, so shadows danced around the room. They created the illusion of movement. And for a moment I stared at the portrait, the woman's eyes peering at me from above the darkened fireplace. And was as if the flickering of recognition fell across the face. I shuddered, believing that it was merely a trick of the light. But still, the face looked on. And then I heard the creaking again, a series of quick clicks, like an aching door that had not been opened for an age, slowly moving into the night. But I could not see the source. My heart raced as I looked around, and for the first time I noticed the dim light, and there lay an old wooden wardrobe on the other side of the room. The creaking sounded once more. A frightful unease began to take over as each click sounded that both puzzled and repulsed me. I turned to the door and I twisted the handle as hard as I could, but the reality had not changed. I was locked in that room with a body rotting under the sheets and a clicking noise coming from inside the wardrobe. A noise that felt organic, alive somehow, differing itself from the shifting contractions of the wood floor and beams of the old house. It at once sounded natural and yet felt unnatural. Another creaking and clicking, and I knew that I had to look at the wardrobe across the room. I was terrified by what I might find, but the anticipation of waiting, just waiting until something threatening emerged from the wooden tomb, was too much to bear. I wanted this torturous night to be over, to return to my adult life. Something had compelled me to visit my ancestral home, but I was sure that if I felt the cold breeze of the outside world again, I would curse that place and never return. Obscured memories flickered in front of my eyes once more, the familiarity of the perfume stinging my senses. The room, a dreadful window into my past. I could not be tortured like this, played with. I had to know what was inside that wardrobe. And I stepped forward, moving around and then to the foot of the bed. I was certain that the portrait stared on menacingly, but I dared not catch its eye, and so my gaze remained fixed on the wardrobe as I neared. The clicking and creaking noise sounded intermittently. With each step I listened intently, something being greeted by the horrid sound. Other times being welcomed by the silence, an equally unappalling nightmare noise. As I reached my hand out to the wardrobe door, my blood ran cold. The door moved, ever so slightly. But it did move. I could see an inch of the darkness inside, a small sliver of black air, and I felt as though a watchful eye was glaring at me from within it. A creak reapplied to my proximity, this time louder than before. It took on a new characteristic, like knuckles being clicked, bone and ligament snapping in place, limbs that had not moved for an age breaking free of time's relentless hold. I reached my hand out slowly and pulled the door open with force. And for a moment, I thought as though I saw two eyes in the dark of the wardrobe peering at me. But as the light from the room's solitary candle reached the dark place, I saw nothing. No clothes, no belongings, no creeping eyes, just the emptiness of life now vacant. And I sighed with relief. But when I turned to the room, I froze. Something was different. Something had changed. It wasn't the portrait on the wall. The bitter face of the woman in the painting stared onward. It wasn't the fireplace either, remaining as it did, unlit, its mouth bathed in night. It wasn't the door on the other side of the room, my only avenue for escape, standing closed, no doubt locked by some unseen jailer. No, none of these things had changed. But what had frightened me, tore at any composure I still had within me, was the figure lying under the covers in the bed. That dead, silent corpse that filled the air with perfume and macabre aura. It was gone. The red blanket had been pulled aside, revealing white silk sheets. And the only evidence that someone had been lying there was an impression in the mattress, an outline of a now missing body. I gasped as the creaking sounded once more, this time from the bed. But there was no sign of the body. The room was unoccupied, and yet the air did not feel absent of company. Something was there. I looked around, and it was then that I entertained the thought, one otherwise which had been preposterous to me. Perhaps it was an invisible specter that had been lying under the red blanket. An apparition with the body of a person, but transparent to the naked eye. Creaking noise. And that noise drew closer. Another creak. This time from the foot of the bed. Whatever it was slowly walking towards me. The warped floorboard shifting under its weight, the only sign that I wasn't alone. If only I could see the cadaverous thing before it placed its rotten hands on me. And with that thought, I leapt on the bed. And as the specter stepped forward, I pulled the sheets off the mattress, throwing them into the air like a net. They fluttered with movement, bringing them with then sweet, rancid perfume. And then they came to rest. But not on the floor. Instead, they covered the walking corpse, showing me its outline. A shrouded dress of white sheets resting over something hideous beneath. Perhaps I could have allowed the thing to walk unseen. For the sight of the long draped sheet stepped towards me, almost stopping my heart. Each invisible footstep brought me within pangs of dread, the likes of which I had never experienced before. And then came the rustling, as something else moved underneath the sheets, a prodding motion. As what I could only assume were two hands outstretched beneath their shroud reached out towards me. I stumbled backwards and I cried out, and as I did, the room dimmed. My retreat had led me into the wardrobe. The arms of the shrouded figure were now almost upon me, and the only recourse was to pull the wooden doors of the wardrobe towards me to shelter me from this thing. My newfound sanctuary shook violently as the shrouded specter heaved and pulled at the door. I held on with my every might, my fingers poking out into the room, grasping onto the piece of the wood, the only barrier between me and the rotted apparition. Memories began to flood back. The dark wardrobe had triggered to painful events that I had managed to bury deep within me. Of a little girl locked in a dark place. Cellars, attics, and wardrobes. A girl put upon, beaten, and mocked, emotionally tortured by her one and only caregiver. My body convulsed and shivered as the reality of my early childhood had filtered through. The attack ceased, and silence became my world. And that's when I heard two whispers. Little Sophie. The words were more breath than voice, and in them I recognized the speaker. My grandmother, that horrid woman who had abused her duty. I was an only child, I screamed at the top of my lungs. How could you? And still I held on tightly to the door, sure that the spirit of my grandmother stood in front of it. This was confirmed to me when I felt a warm, sticky breath on my fingers. A mouth, seen or unseen, must have hovered over them for a moment, exhaling foul air. Then something wet licked the length of my fingers, a rotten tongue from beyond. But I dared not open the door, because there was little that I could do. I held on to it tightly while the ghost of my twisted grandmother licked at my exposed flesh. And then nothing. Again, silence. No breath. No shaking of the doors. Nothing. Teeth dripped with saliva, then bit hard down onto my fingers. I screamed in agony as they delved deep through my skin and then crunched onto bone. Under my screams of pain, I heard a laugh of delight. History had repeated itself as more memories flooded through the torture. She had done awful things in the past. Malevolent, twisted things. Locking me in the darkness, beating, prodding, and more. The pain of memory mixed with the pain of moment of those dreaded teeth that ground deeper. No more. I screamed and I raged and I pushed the wardrobe door, knocking the shrouded figure to the ground. My fingers gushed blood, but they were free, just as I was. I leaped onto the bed and I charged for the locked door once more. I yelled and I cried and I fought as the door remained tightly closed. It would not budge. I pounded and I railed against my imprisonment. The two hands reached from behind, wrapping sheet-covered fingers around my neck. And we struggled. The grip around my throat tightened, choking the breath from me. And in a moment's rage, a moment of pure survival, I reached for the solitary candle that sat by the bed and cast it to the feet of my grandmother, catching the shroud of the sheets. And the room burned. The bed, painting, the wardrobe. And my last memory was looking beside me to see my grandmother's corpse burning on the ground. I was found standing in the garden of my family home, dazed, watching it collapse in and on itself, consumed by flames. I had returned to my childhood home to oversee my grandmother's things after she was done with this mortal world. But it appeared that she was not done with me. And after this night, at long last, I was certainly done with her.
I drove the U-Haul through the unrelenting rain of the Washington countryside. The windshield wipers worked furiously as I struggled to get a clear view of the unpaved road I'd been driving on. I just dropped out of college. I had enough money saved, however, to give my dream as a writer a chance. My uncle, who I was fairly close with ever since my father had died, had a couple rental homes in the Pacific Northwest. I wasn't from here, so it was a bit of a change of scenery for me. Uncle Bryce offered me one of his lower quality homes to rent for practically nothing. Despite not having seen the place, I accepted. I pulled off the gravel road and called him really quick. My poor directions, mixed with the constant downpour and the lack of road signs, made finding this place nearly impossible. He answered in 2 rings, almost as if he was anticipating the call. "Hey, Bug, having trouble?" His voice slightly amused. I gave a light chuckle despite being frustrated. "Yeah, I've just been on the road a good bit and I haven't seen it yet. I'm just worried I passed it since it's not showing on the maps." "Yeah, Google really screwed up the maps on this one. No one can ever find it." "Have you crossed a bridge yet?" he asked inquisitively. I racked my brain but was fairly certain that I hadn't. No bridge yet." "Okay, good. If you crossed the bridge, then you've gone too far. You're coming from the south, so the place will be on your left. There's no mailbox there, but there is a large stone right at the turn-in." I rubbed my brow. "Okay, before the bridge, a large stone at the turn-in. Got it," I said. "Okay, well, call me if you need anything else," he said before hanging up. The rain lightened slightly, but the overcast hardly changed. I put the wipers down a speed and pulled back onto the road. Sure enough, within 5 minutes, a large stone was seen on the left-hand side of the road, and an ominous-looking dirt road led deep into the dark woods. "There we are," I said, as I focused on pulling the van into the narrow driveway. Had it not been for the stone, I would have never seen the place through the impenetrable trees. I'm glad I called Uncle Bryce when I did. The driveway, if you could call it that, was even worse than the gravel road. It was more of a trail than anything. An unmarked trail, really. Thankfully, the driveway wasn't terribly long, and soon enough, a quaint little home stood in the slightest of clearings. There was a small front yard where poorly maintained grass sprouted through the thick dead pine needles that laid everywhere. The single-story home, despite its sad surroundings of haunting gloom, had a charm to it. A place where a good cup of coffee and a good book would cure just about any cold. Perfect for any writer. I hopped out of the van and quickly jogged over to the porch, doing my best to cover my head from the thick rain. Once sheltered by the mossy porch overhang, I approached the door and entered my code, which my uncle gave me. The new number pad on the old worn door was quite the juxtaposition, like a caveman using a smartphone instead of a torch, but perhaps that was the point. The lock beeped with each number I put in, including the enter button, which lit up green when completed. I could hear the mechanism whir inside the door, unlocking it. I pushed the door open and surprisingly, it was heavy. Inside was slightly cooler but very dark. Practically no natural light entered this place. It was as if this place was condemned to an eternity of wet darkness. I flipped the lights on and a warm glow illuminated the home. Dated but fairly nice furniture stood scattered in a way that an interior designer must have had some influence. Bearskin rugs laid on the floor and walls while distasteful hunting mounts hung silently, watching my every move with lifeless eyes. I went through the home, inspecting my new residence with curiosity and surprise. I made sure to leave the lights on for each room I went into. I was a bit uneasy, entering a home I'd never been in before, just making sure that everything was in fact empty. I wasn't sure how often Uncle Bryce checked on his properties, but I wanted to make sure a squatter didn't give me a nasty surprise. I didn't own a gun, but for the first time in my life, I wish I did. After 10 minutes of walking the home, I was satisfied with knowing I was alone. I wouldn't want to live here forever. The overall mood and aura of the place was scary, but I kinda liked it. It was one of those places that wasn't the best, but good for what you needed at the moment. The old style and design took me back to my childhood. Something you might see at a friend's house or perhaps an older relative. But still, something about the home or the area in general was off-putting. I wasn't completely comfortable with being here alone, mainly because I wasn't familiar with it. The gloom outside was eerie enough, but being tucked away in this wooden thicket of solitude and darkness compounded into a mental state that was completely foreign to me. It felt like I was trespassing, like danger was just looming behind the corner. The rain outside was still an issue, which gave me a perfect excuse to not unpack my stuff. I was tired after the long drive. I laid on the couch, wanting to waste time watching TV, but sure enough, this house didn't have one. I also noted that it didn't have any Wi-Fi. Cellular data still worked, but reception was poor. This was perfect, especially for an aspiring writer that was battling constant issues with brain rot. But I took comfort in knowing that most people also had that same problem. This environment, removed from distractions, would just cause me to focus even more. I checked the time and decided to call it an early evening. I grabbed the essentials from the van outside and set up in one of the empty rooms. It was quite early in the evening, but it didn't take long for me to fall asleep. I woke up the next morning before my alarm clock. It was quite dark out. I peered outside and was able to confirm that the rain had finally stopped. I got up and realized that all my stuff was still in the U-Haul, and that if I wanted coffee, I would need to unpack it. I spent a good portion of the morning tackling the titanic issue of unloading the van, in desperate hopes of having a decent breakfast anytime soon. I finally put all the boxes inside, although I didn't empty them, and whipped up a quick breakfast with what little food I brought with me. I had so much leftover time today since I got up early that I wasn't sure what to do with the rest of my day. I still had to unpack the boxes themselves, but I crossed that bridge when I got there. I doom scrolled on my phone as I finished breakfast, rays of light barely able to creep through the woods, and the dense fog that seemed to cling on the green branches. I looked outside with optimism. Sunshine? I had to take advantage of it. Nothing is more naturally beautiful than a hike in the Pacific Northwest. Even in a weird forest like this, you're bound to be amazed by nature. I went to my room and to the closet where I had set several boxes of my clothes. The closet had a faint musty odor, but I didn't really mind. I pulled the drawstring to the light and it flickered on. I searched the boxes for my boots, but made an interesting discovery. In the dark corner of the closet was a small door. I'd never seen anything like this before. I walked over and turned my flashlight on my phone as I got on my hands and knees. I opened the door, and to my amazement, it accessed underneath the house. A crawlspace. I was aware of the concepts, but I'd never seen one like this being accessed in a closet before. I peered inside briefly, before eventually closing the door. I had to take advantage of the weather before it would quickly turn on me. I dug through my stuff and eventually found my old boots as well as a good raincoat, just in case. I exited the home while punching in the code to the front door. I knew that there probably wasn't anyone around for miles, but I was alone and it was a good habit to make sure I did. I walked around to the backyard, but it was just as bad, if not worse, than the front yard. To my disappointment, I didn't see a trailhead, but I did see one of those cheap small fire pits you could buy at Walmart. The sun casted muffled shadows in the fog, nestled in the trees beyond. I looked to the back of the house and saw a small door, much like the one I saw in my closet, which I assumed was the outer access to the crawlspace. I went to the front of the house and walked up to the main road. I started hiking north. Maybe I'll find the bridge, I thought. I whistled a song or two as I ventured on the poor excuse of the roadway. The wet gravel sloshed under my boots as I ventured northward. The small road was desolate. No signs of cars or other humans aside from the gravel itself shone in the vibrant landscape. I could hear thunder in the distance, but thankfully, the sun prevailed. However, this wouldn't last for very long. I stopped whistling and decided to turn back before I got rained on. Just as I reached the driveway, small droplets pittered on my coat. I enjoyed the brief walk I managed to get, but I needed to start writing. I didn't have Wi-Fi, so I just had to pull up a Word document. The brief moments of sun flood, leaving me back in shadowy fog. I tried to write. I really did, but all inspiration had been exhausted by the move. All I could think of to write was horror. I didn't normally write horror, but I did write a ghost story or two back in the day. Granted, that was a while ago, and I moved on to other genres. Seeing how I was unfit for a writing session, an idea popped into my mind. I remembered the fire pit out back, and I decided that if I were to have a fire in this wet wasteland, I'd need to find some wood and let it dry first. I didn't have a hatchet or a saw, so I would need to gather the wood that I could find, laying around. It was still slightly raining, but it was only going to get worse throughout the day. I put my raincoat back on and went into the backyard. I pressed past the grass and tall weeds and ventured my way into the woods. My cheery optimism, accompanied with my whistling, cut through the eerie atmosphere. The air was crisp, with a slight smell of pine. The pine needles provided enough of a canopy to keep the rain from reaching me. I found some sticks that I gathered, but nothing big. I made several trips back and forth, keeping my eyes open. I eventually found a dead tree nestled on the back, and I was able to break some of the small branches off with what little strength that I had. I put all that I had gathered into the garage when my phone rang. It was my uncle. I answered. Hey, Uncle Bryce. Hey, Bug, just checking on you. I assumed you found the place. I sure did. It's cute, I responded. I don't know if it's cute, but it should hold you over for however long you need. Hey, really quick, I totally spaced on this, but don't go too deep into the backyard. He fumbled with his words for a moment. If you go back there far enough, it's a hunting ground. I paused. I didn't tell him I was just back there. I just agreed. Okay, yeah, sure. I'll stay out of there. He breathed a sigh of relief. Okay, great. I can't believe I almost forgot that. How are you? He forced the conversation to pretend that he wanted to catch up. I was polite and entertained the small talk, but the conversation eventually ended. I hung up and closed the garage door and went inside. Night seemed to come earlier, but that was due to the trees. I had totally gotten sidetracked, and I had forgotten to get groceries that day, so I made a last-minute drive into town and grabbed some food. Driving back was much easier now, knowing that I had to look for the stone. The gravel road was still an eerie drive. It didn't help that the sky was thick with darkness. I made a point to leave some lights on in the house, but it didn't matter. I wasn't visible from the road. I pulled into the driveway and back inside. I spent most of the evening on my phone when the battery started getting low. I remembered the wood I had gathered earlier and went out to the garage to find it fairly dry. I saw an old canister of gas which I grabbed, and I made 2 trips out back to the fire pit to carry the wood. I went back inside to try to find some matches, but I couldn't. I didn't smoke, so I didn't have a lighter. Dang, I couldn't believe I didn't grab the one thing I needed to start a fire. I'll get it tomorrow. I went out back to put the wood away, so it would stay dry. I did the same with the gas canister, which, now thinking about it, was probably too old to be useful. However, as I was in the backyard, my attention was drawn to the oppressive darkness just beyond. The back porch light only lit so much. I glanced out there, thinking about what my uncle had said earlier. He was probably right about it being hunting land, but the way he said it was so weird. Like he made it up on the spot. I don't recall how long I'd been staring at the woods, but a distant sound from within jarred me from my trance. It sounded like a heavy branch had broken. I jumped and went back inside. I made a point, though, to deadbolt the back door. I spent the rest of the night on my phone in my room. My phone was low on battery, so it had to be connected to a charger, so I ended up having to take breaks and finished unpacking several boxes in my room. Next to the bed were these big shelves that held several books, as well as random antiques used to decorate the room. I had removed all the items and began placing my large collection of plushies I had acquired over the years. I had so many, and they were so big that they all couldn't fit on the 2 shelves above my bed. I let time get away from me, and I decided way too late to go to bed. I found my toiletry bag in one of the boxes and went to the bathroom down the hall. I made sure to leave some of the lights on in the house to provide some comfort. The noise I heard out in the woods from earlier had me on edge. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard a strange noise. Normally, I am one to dismiss something as a natural cause. Despite having written 2 cheesy ghost stories, I didn't actually believe in ghosts. But this sound that I heard had stopped me in my tracks. Having thought I imagined it, I turned off the water and listened to the silent hum when I heard the distinct sound of whistling outside. What freaked me out even more was the tune that it was whistling. It was the same tune I had been whistling when I was outside. Who or whatever was whistling must have seen me, or at least heard me. The sound was coming from the back of the house towards the woods. A brief thought crept into my mind of going back there and checking it out, but I wasn't going to do that, especially since I was unarmed and alone. I then thought about just leaving, making a run for it to the U-Haul and getting out of here. As I was debating what to do, the sound eventually stopped. It's one of those things where I wish it kept doing it more. That way I could validate some type of action to get out of here, but it never did. I stood in the hallway, looking to the rear of the house, straining my ears to hear anything, but I didn't. I went to bed that night unsure of what I was experiencing. The rain made it difficult to hear anything outside, but I was now aware that something might be lurking out there. The next morning I got up later than usual. I kept waking up throughout the night at random times, so when I finally did fall asleep, it was later than normal. I got up and made breakfast with the last amount of food I brought with me. I needed to go to the store. While I was eating, last night's events came back to me. I went out the back door and looked into the woods, unsure of what I was going to find, if anything. Nothing was out of the ordinary. I went back inside and got ready for the day. I made sure I had a list of things to get while I was in town, matches being one of them. I took my time getting ready, making a list in the process and locking up before leaving. Driving the U-Haul was not ideal as a commuter car, but that's all I had at the moment. I needed to make arrangements to drop this off somewhere and get a smaller rental somewhere else, but I had a couple more days on the agreement that I wanted to use. I drove into town. They only had mom and pop stores rather than anything that I would recognize. I picked one and pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. I was quick with my shopping. I only needed food and a handful of odds and ends, but everything else I had brought with me. I drove back in the cloudy weather, slightly anxious about going home. I considered going on another walk as the rain had yet to make its daily presence, but I then remembered my late-night visitor. Someone had been outside whistling. My desire to go on a walk faded. I made it back to the gravel road. I was thinking about what I was going to make for dinner when I saw a strange sight in the middle of the road. It was the first time I'd seen anything on this road, but it wasn't the car. It was large and hulking, but its dark mass confused me as it stood against the gloomy backdrop of the foggy woods. I slowed up the van and squinted my eyes as its appearance began to make more sense to me. I was nearly on top of it when I finally realized what it was. It was a horse. A black horse stood in the middle of the road, its hair matted and unkempt. I checked for a saddle, but it didn't have one. I rolled down the window as it was within arm's reach of me, but it didn't move. It just shifted its head in my direction and looked at me head on. "Hey there, buddy," I cooed to the beast. "What are you doing out here?" I reached my arm out to try to pet it, but I then saw its eyes. They were milky white. The flesh of the beast gave off a terrible odor, and I realized touching a potential feral animal was probably not the best idea. It looked at me with full attention, a bizarre thing you don't really see in wild animals, unless they're predatory. I drew my arm back and rolled up the window. "Yeah, no," I said, as I continued driving down the road. I have never seen a wild horse before. I didn't even think that was a thing still, but I could be wrong. I saw the stone and was about to pull in when another bizarre sight caught my attention. On the stone was a crow. Its feathers scattered and clumped as if it was crushed on top of the stone, or maybe it flew directly into it. Its legs were sticking up, twisted and broken, resting in a violent manner. Underneath the bird, its blood had been arranged, forming symbols and letters that were unfamiliar to me. I parked the van and got out to take a better look. I looked around, seeing nothing but the endless trees. What the hell? I called my uncle, but he didn't answer. It appeared that someone was giving me a hard time, or something else was happening that I didn't know about. I took a picture of the bird and another of what was on the stone and texted it to Uncle Bryce. "What is this?" I texted. Offended by the sight, I found a stick and removed the bird. I tossed the stick in the woods and got back into the van. I reached the house and unloaded the groceries quickly. I made an effort to check my phone to see if Uncle Bryce responded, but he hadn't. The rest of the day was accompanied by uneasy tension of the prior events. To take my mind off of things, I took some medicine to help calm me down, but I hesitated, knowing that if I did, I wouldn't be able to drive. I should be fine tonight," I said as I swallowed 2 pills. Despite having bought matches to start a fire, I decided on not going back outside. I had seen too much weird stuff today to not be in the right mindset to actually enjoy the woods. In fact, it would be the opposite. When the medicine had finally kicked in, I found myself going to bed quite early. I wasn't sure if it was fate, or if the effects of the medicine wore off at the right time, but I found myself waking up to a unique but horrifying sound coming from the front of the house. It wasn't the whistling I had heard the night prior, but the beeping of the keypad on the door. Someone was trying to get in. I sat up in bed, listening as random numbers were entered, but access was denied. I could hear the slight jingling of the handle, but all of this was done with stealth. Whoever was out there was trying to be quiet. However, this didn't last long. The handle twisted louder and the door shook. The sturdy frame and the heavy door held tightly. Soon banging on the door could be heard, as whoever this was clearly frustrated. Startled, I tried to remain quiet as I called the police. A polite and calm woman responded, asking for my address. I panicked as I didn't have it on hand. However, it was in my text with my uncle from just a few days ago. I opened my text to find the address when the banging had stopped. I paused, looking around nervously as I was unsure whoever was outside and what they were doing now. I finally found the address and gave it to the woman on the phone. She informed me that it would take the police about 40 minutes to get there. It might as well have been a million years, I thought. She wanted to keep me on the phone as I waited for the police, which I obviously agreed to. I then heard a sound coming from the back of the house, like something opening, but I made sure to lock all the doors I could think of. It then got real quiet, and the woman on the phone asked me what was going on. I told her that the banging had stopped, but something else was going on. I couldn't hear or actually see any danger, but my mind was screaming at me. My nerves were firing as my fight-or-flight system kicked in. I was in danger, but I wasn't sure why. It finally dawned on me what was going on, but when it did, it was far too late. I could hear the door open within the closet, and it all made sense what was happening. Someone had entered through the crawlspace and was now in my closet. I wanted to get up and barricade the door, but I was too terrified. Even if I did, I wouldn't have enough stuff to stop whoever was trying to come in. The woman on the phone kept talking and making noise, which I finally just had to hang up on her. I did the only thing I could think to do, which was to hide. I got up on my shelf above my bed and moved my plushies so I could lay behind them. I just prayed to God that the shelf would hold. I heard the door handle turn slowly in the dark room. I peered through the plushies to see it opening slowly. Had it went through this approach first, I probably would have never heard it come in. The door opened silently as a horrid figure shrouded in shadows entered my room. I couldn't see much as the darkness concealed the thing that just entered, but it also hid me as well. I could hear it approach my bed, and the putrid smell of decay reached my nose. Whoever this was, it wasn't someone I wanted to meet. My phone rang again, which was lying on my bed. It was facing upwards and illuminated a small portion of my room, which revealed a horrifying sight. Standing near the closet was a tall, skinny figure. Its skin seemed oddly shiny, reflecting the LED light off of my phone. I watched in horror as it did something I never thought I would see. It approached my phone, each step revealing this figure was more monster than human. A long arm extended as a clawed hand grabbed my phone and answered it. Whatever this thing was, it was silent for a moment. The familiar voice of the woman was on the other line, asking questions. "How are you? Are you safe? What's going on?" This and other things could be vaguely heard as I laid only feet above. Terror struck me as the creature responded, but not in a voice matching its terrible appearance, but mine. My voice. My young feminine voice. "I'm better now. Turns out it was just the neighbor's dog," it responded. I silently gasped as I fought back tears, my heart beating loudly in my chest. I could tell the woman on the line was confused, since there was a noticeable pause on the line. "Are you sure? Do you still need help?" she asked. "I'm okay," the beast answered. "I don't need help anymore. Thank you." I was astonished. Not only could this thing replicate my voice almost perfectly, it just called off my help. The woman on the other line tried asking more questions, but the creature hung up, preventing any more conversation. I was doomed. I knew the second the creature turned a light on, I'd be found, but it never did. I laid only feet above the bed, my small army of plushies providing an incredible small barrier against this thing. It searched the room briefly, but never thought to glance at the shelves. It then opened the bedroom door to the rest of the house and walked out silently, slightly hunched as if it was ready to attack. My eyes locked into the doorway, waiting for any moment for the creature to come back and kill me. I could hear soft shufflings and things being moved ever so slightly. Even if I wanted to leave, I had no idea where this thing was in the house. I laid on that shelf for what felt like hours, waiting for the sun to rise or a clear indication that the creature left the home, but it never did. I laid in darkness, just praying for anything to get me out of this situation, but I was on my own. I breathed deeply, trying to think how on earth I would be able to get out of this situation in one piece, when I glanced over to the closet. A faint, terrible idea whispered in my mind. I didn't know where this thing was in the house, but I knew for sure where it wasn't. It wasn't in the crawlspace. It would never look for me there. I just had to be smart about this, as I would only have one shot of getting out of here. I shifted my weight slowly, just praying that the shelves wouldn't creak. I was able to make it onto the bed and then onto the floor. I searched briefly for my phone, but I couldn't find it. There was a good chance that the creature still had it. I grabbed the U-Haul key, which I thankfully kept in my room, and entered the closet. The closet was pitch black. I felt around as I blindly stumbled into the small area. I finally felt the door, which was left open, and crouched down into the small space. Once inside, I had to think. Where was the door that led to the backyard? I couldn't see anything, so I had to rack my brain the layout of the home as to guess which way I needed to go. The cold, wet ground added unneeded difficulty to the already terrifying situation. Above me, I could hear the sounds of floorboards creaking as the creature continued to scour the home. I crawled on my hands and knees, feeling the damp walls, just hoping that eventually I'd feel a door. I spent hours down in the crawlspace, crying and silently screaming to myself. The sounds above me eventually got louder as the creature got more and more frustrated. I'd crawled aimlessly for hours down here without making any progress. Eventually, the sounds above me stopped completely. I just sat in the fetal position, ready for whatever this thing was to come down here and grab me. I could tell it was morning time because I could hear the birds outside chirp their cheerful tune, completely oblivious to the hellish night I just spent. I perked up. I could finally see the faintest rays of the morning light coming from the furthest direction of the crawlspace. I still had to be smart though. I didn't hear the thing leave the house above. It was still inside. It had to be. I crawled slowly towards the dim light, shivering with both anticipation and the cold night I just endured in the crawlspace. I finally reached the door, peering out slowly to find the gloom landscape to greet me. I was so tired. I emerged from the darkened space beneath and slowly rose to my feet. The next series of moments were just a blur. All rationale and critical thinking went out the window. I bolted with all the energy I had to the front of the house. The large van sat tucked away in the morning fog. I didn't have my wallet or my phone, just the keys to the behemoth vehicle. I got out of there, without ever looking back at the house.